Hey, how you doing? It is I, the Terrorific Lady, otherwise known as Brandy, and welcome to Retro Horror School, and a happy Friday to you. I bet you can't guess what day it is. It is Friday the 13th, one of two Friday the 13ths that we have for the year 2024. And what better way to celebrate Friday the 13th than to do a franchise ranking? I am so excited. Friday the 13th is a franchise that consists of 12 films, a TV series, a video game, comic books, and merch. And it is one of the most successful, not just horror franchises, but one of the most successful franchises, period, due to its references in pop culture and also due to its merch sales. And Jason's hockey mask is one of the most iconic and recognizable things in pop culture. So, suffice it to say, a little movie that was made in 1980 spawned a franchise that is still recognizable and relevant 44 years later. What I like about this franchise too is that it's relatively easy to dive into. Each movie is about 90 minutes, so an hour and a half long. So you will get through each movie relatively quick. The longest in the franchise, I believe, is Friday the 13th Part 8. But yeah, it's a really easy franchise to get into. The story is cohesive and coherent from parts 1 through 8. Veers a little bit off at part 9, but you will still be able to enjoy it even though it veers off, and you will still have a good time with it. Now, before we get started, what I want to let you know is, as always, my ranking of the Friday the 13th franchise is not the end all be all of rankings. Your rankings will most likely differ from mine, and that is perfectly fine and perfectly cool. If you want to share your rankings or your favorite movies out of the Friday the 13th franchise, let me know below. In my rankings, I will try to discuss what I liked, what I didn't like about it, what I felt worked for me, and what I felt didn't. So, without further ado, let's dive right into the Friday the 13th franchise rankings. Number 12 and the last on my list is Jason Goes to Hell, the final Friday, where Jason is portrayed by Kane Hodder. It is the second lowest grossing movie in the franchise, and it had a similar concept to Nightmare on Elm Street Part 5, The Dream Child, where Jason's spirit is transferring to other people to try and stay alive, where in Nightmare on Elm Street Part 5, The Dream Child, Freddy's spirit is working through Alice's unborn child. This reminds me a lot of Freddy's Dead, The Final Nightmare, in that Freddy had a daughter, and in this one, Jason has like relatives and a bloodline, and that bloodline is the only one who can kill him. I don't know. To me, the story didn't really connect, and things seem to come out of left field and seem to come out of nowhere. For instance, maybe I missed it, but how does this random bounty hunter know just how to kill Jason? How does he know? And maybe it's because of the fact that Jason's spirit has to transfer from one body to another. And I know that they were trying to try something new. But to me, the whole point of Friday the 13th is Jason. And if Jason's spirit is transferring from different body to different body, then Jason really doesn't have much of an identity in this film, which is a shame because his look was really cool. And you did see the Necronomicon in here, and the director, Adam Marcus, even confirmed that yes, Pamela Voorhees, his mother, did some kind of incantation and ritual from the Necronomicon to bring Jason back to life, which in a sense establishes Jason as a deadite. But, and here's my gripe about this, I know Evil Dead, I know the Necronomicon, and I know what it's about. But what if someone was watching this and they didn't know what that was and they couldn't make that connection? You have to be careful in putting Easter eggs and pieces of lore like that in horror movies that people would have to go outside of the horror movie to do their own research and to look it up. It's an Easter egg, but you would have to know Evil Dead to connect with it. And this whole movie was meant to tie in to the whole Freddy versus Jason, because Jason dies at the end of this movie. And you see Freddy's glove coming up out of the ground to grab Jason's mask. So, oh my God, Freddy versus Jason is coming. But 10 years later, since this movie was made in 1993 and Freddy versus Jason did not come out until 2003. This movie was a first watch for me in this franchise, but it failed to impress in a lot of aspects, and that's why it sits firmly at number 12. Number 11. And it kind of pains me to say this because I used to like this a lot more than I did, is Friday the 13th Part 8, Jason Takes Manhattan, which is the lowest grossing film in the franchise, and where Jason is once again played by Kane Hodder. Is also the first of the movies in this franchise that is not 90 minutes. So that may be part of the reason why it's a little bit lower on my list than it used to be, because at certain points it felt like there was just a bunch of filler and it dragged. Most of the movie does take place on a boat. You don't technically have Jason landing in Manhattan until about an hour into the movie. So it's Jason Takes Manhattan for about 40 minutes. Now, I know due to budget constraints, they couldn't film entirely in New York City. They did a few shots. They filmed mainly in Canada too, to get the look of New York City. I forgot which city exactly that they filmed in Canada, though. A lot of this movie to me is unintentionally funny. I think of parts like Jason in Times Square going past the dudes and kicking the boombox, because Jason Voorhees hates music. I guess he hates New York, and he also hates music. Also, the boxing match between Jason and that one guy in the tracksuit, where Jason ends up knocking his block off, almost like Shorty in Killer Clowns from Outer Space. I also really like the look of this Jason and the design of this Jason, and this is where the design of this mask that I hand painted came from, is from Friday the 13th Part 8, Jason Takes Manhattan. I still like this movie and have a lot of good memories of it. I just like it a little bit less than I did before, and I can't really explain why, because I like isolation and they're isolated on a boat. So maybe it's just because of the extra runtime in the movie is probably what hurt things. It's been a little while since I watched it. So the slow pacing, the fact that the slow pacing and the filler combined with the fact that they were mainly on a boat, you were waiting for Jason to get to Manhattan. And then once they did, it didn't really pay off for me. So that is why Jason Takes Manhattan, unfortunately, is in my number 11 spot. Number 10 is Friday the 13th Part 3, the only film in the franchise to be filmed in 3D, and the film which Jason finally gets his hockey mask and is on the path to becoming iconic. It immediately follows the events of Friday the 13th Part 2. You have Jason, who is injured right after the events of Friday the 13th Part 2, killing more people, getting his mask, going to another place to kill more people. It may surprise some people to have this movie, which basically made Jason iconic, as so low on my list. But here's a lot of my gripes with it. Richard Brooker took on the role of Jason, and I didn't care for his iteration of Jason. I thought it was a bit too stiff at times and not really how I imagine Jason. The characters looked a little bit too old to be considered college age kids. The stoners in particular, and that kind of took me out of things a bit and took me out of the immersion of the film. And Jason doesn't get his mask until about an hour into the movie, much like Jason didn't start taking Manhattan until about an hour into the movie. It took too long for him to get his mask. I could tell it was kind of a throwback to Friday the 13th, the first one, except Pamela as the lady in the lake coming up out to grab someone. Like, I honestly just I don't get it. As I really don't. And whenever I think of a Friday the 13th movie, this is not one that I particularly go to. I have the same problems with it as I did Friday the 13th Part 8, Jason Takes Manhattan, with the pacing. It is one step above Jason Takes Manhattan because of its iconic status and the fact that this is where Jason really became Jason. But yeah, Friday the 13th Part 3 is in my number 10 spot. Number 9 in my rankings is Friday the 13th Part 5, A New Beginning, where you had Dick Wyand as Jason. I'll explain that here in a little bit. You have grown-up Tommy Jarvis that is going to this low security, I think, mental institution, almost like farm ranch, to try and get better because therapy and medication is not working for him. And things start to go awry whenever one of the teens or college age people that live on the ranch killed another one. And this set off a chain of events to where Jason comes back, and Tommy thinks that he's going crazy because he thinks he sees Jason, and then Jason is gone. And then through a series of events, it all comes down to where Jason gets killed. Now, I like the aspect that they did with Tommy thinking that he sees Jason and that he is going crazy. I thought that was an interesting, cool thing to do. And this movie has a lot of kills. In fact, it is one of the Friday the 13th movies that has the highest number of kills, and some pretty creative ones too. Jason kills someone by putting a flare in the mouth. Jason kills someone by using a pair of gardening shears. This is also the film that has the most nude scenes and sex scenes, so it is very much a slasher in the fact that there is a lot of kills, a lot of nakedness, and a lot of sex. It's considered by some to be the worst entry in the franchise, and I don't think it is the worst entry in the franchise because they did try to do something different. And why I said Jason near the beginning is that if you remember, I was talking about that one of the young men on the farm killed, or the farm, or like the rehabilitation ranch, killed another one. This was Jason's son. Roy, the paramedic, was posing as Jason, a copycat killer, to try and get his own twisted form of revenge for his son dying. And I like that they tried to do something different. I thought that was an interesting take. And this is the last of the Friday the 13th films where Jason is considered human. It starts veering into supernatural territory with Friday the 13th Part 6, Jason Lives. I felt that where it suffered a little bit is there were some things that were not needed and that took away from the film. For instance, I don't know why we needed the farm people, the mother and the son. To me, they served no purpose, and if you cut their subplot out of the movie entirely, then you would be missing nothing. But overall, I felt it was an okay movie. Definitely not garbage like people are saying. Not my absolute best favorite, but I feel a decent movie, which is why it's at number 9. Number 8 is Friday the 13th Part 4, the final chapter. I say final because, of course, we know that it's not the final chapter, with Ted White playing Jason, who was uncredited in the film. He asked to not be credited in the film for reasons I will talk about. You have little Tommy Jarvis and his sister and his mom who are out in a cabin in the woods, I believe near Crystal Lake. And you got Jason, who, surprise, surprise, wants to come around to that area to do some killing. So besides Tommy Jarvis and his mom and his sister, there is a group of people who are in another cabin kind of near theirs. And of course, we know Jason doesn't like college kids being in cabins or around Crystal Lake. So he starts to go on a killing spree. That's a pretty common thread in these Friday the 13th movies. Jason does not like college age kids. Jason does not like them drinking or doing drugs or having sex. He just does not like it. This movie received negative reviews on its release, but it has been looked at now as one of the better movies in the franchise, and rightfully so. You have Tom Savini, who came back to this one to do the makeup effects because he thought, probably like everybody, that this is going to be the final Jason movie. He wanted to help kill Jason, who he created in the original Friday the 13th, with the makeup effects. Now, I mentioned that Ted White is Jason in this one. And he was a stuntman long before he did Friday the 13th. He was a stuntman for John Wayne, like way back in the day. And he took this job just for the money, but he really did get into the psychology of Jason. He didn't talk to many people on set. He stayed pretty silent, but he didn't particularly like his experience on the film. And he asked for his name to be removed from the credits. And his bad experience stems to the fact that he didn't care much for the way that the young actors were treated on this movie, especially one of the young women who was made by the director to stay naked in the lake for hours and hours on end. And she was, I think I remember hearing that she was in danger of getting hypothermia, and he was like, get her out of the lake now. She needs to get warm. So he didn't have a particularly good time filming it, which is why you don't see Ted White's name in the credits as Jason. I mean, it's a shame. I mean, it's really a shame because I thought he was a decent Jason. I mean, his stunt work showed he could take a hit, and I thought he did a decent job as Jason. I also like the brother-sister angle and how the brother and sister, Tommy Jarvis and his sister, were two survivors at the end of this movie, which is something that hadn't been done in the franchise up to that point. There's always been just one survivor. Here there were two. And I can't let this review go by without mentioning the Crispin Glover dance. You got to mention the Crispin Glover dance. It's like Ed Harris's dance in Creepshow. I mean, Crispin Glover's dance was iconic, and it's an iconic part of Friday the 13th. I also thought the way that Jason died was cool, with his head sliding down the machete and being cut in half. I thought the ending was a little bit weird because it was making it out like Tommy was evil or something, or he was possessed with evils. But I kind of leave it to the fact that they probably wanted an ambiguous ending to kind of end the franchise. But yeah, overall, I thought the story was well paced. I thought Ted White was fine as Jason. I like the two survivor angle. And yeah, I feel it earns its number 8 spot for me. The only reason it's all a little bit higher is because there were some other movies in the franchise that I liked better. Number 7 is Friday the 13th, Part 7, The New Blood, with Kane Hodder again as Jason. Kane Hodder played Jason in Parts 7, 8, Jason Goes to Hell, and Jason X. This is basically Carrie versus Jason. You have somebody who has telekinetic powers and who is a formidable foe against this Jason, which Jason needs since apparently now he keeps coming back from the dead and can't be killed. This is the only movie in the franchise to have no gore. And the reason for it is that it was heavily edited. It was heavily edited because the Motion Pictures Associations of America, the MPAA, said, well, you have to cut this and you have to cut that and you have to cut that to get a rated R rating. And it was very heavily cut. And you could definitely tell because the editing at certain points was very, very abrupt. It at times didn't really have a cohesive flow. But what's strange enough is that the lack of gore didn't bother me too much. It gave me a Halloween 1978 vibe where you didn't see a lot of gore happening in the film, if that makes sense. The lack of gore didn't bother me, and yes, the editing was abrupt, but I can't really blame the editor or the director since they were forced to make all these cuts. I mean, it's a shame. I would have loved to have seen what the movie would look like without all these cuts because it would probably be a lot higher on my list. People also criticized the inconsistent tone of the movie, the predictable plot, and the Jason first person point of view whenever he was stalking and murdering people. I didn't think the tone was inconsistent. I mean, yeah, they used humor and horror, but I felt that they balanced it really well. Maybe the inconsistency, they felt the inconsistent tone, maybe it came from the editing and the abrupt editing. And I didn't even mind the first person Jason murderer point of view because, again, it reminds me a lot of John Carpenter's Halloween 1978. So I dig that kind of stuff. And you can't even really criticize this film for a predictable plot because, look, you know what you're getting with Friday the 13th films. It's Jason going around killing people and then dying until the next movie. So all slasher movies have a pretty predictable plot, so I feel that's an unfair criticism of this movie. Kane Hodder is credited for giving Jason personality with his movements and his actions, and he had that cool sleeping bag kill, which I forgot was in this movie. It is one of my favorite Jason kills, but I would have to say that there is a movie before this where Jason was given some elements of a personality, and I'll talk about that once I get to it. But I could definitely see where people think that Jason, this is the first movie where Jason was given a personality because also you get to see him without his mask for a little bit, where Tina knocks off his mask and you get to see Jason angry and emote. I thought that was pretty cool. Like I said, this movie would be a lot higher on my list if not for the editing and the chopping up to make the story lack cohesiveness. Again, I don't blame the editor or the director for it. I mean, it is what it is. You gotta do what you gotta do to get that rating. So it's by that I joined this movie, which is why it sits at a solid number 7 for me. Number 6 is the original Friday the 13th from 1980, which is basically a direct ripoff of John Carpenter's Halloween. So Sean S. Cunningham, the director, is like, Halloween made a lot of money. How can we rip it off? And that's where Friday the 13th came from. It was a simple, straightforward story. You had a killer who was stalking kids at Camp Crystal Lake for some unknown reason until the very end of the movie. The killer was always in first person point of view, which I don't understand why that was a complaint in part 7, but then they also did it in part 1. I felt it made sense in part 7, and it also made sense here. It added to the element and the mystery. I don't know, maybe that was also probably part of why I bother people in part 7, because we know it's Jason, so there's really no element of mystery behind it. But I don't mind first person killer point of views. That doesn't bother me. Thomas Savini did the makeup special effects. He did the girl with the axe in the face, the first girl who got her throat slit, the Kevin Bacon kill with the arrow coming up out of his neck. He did the look of Ari Lehman's young Jason, basing it off of someone he knew as a kid. And he also did the Pamela Voorhees head getting cut off. Funny how you clearly see like someone's like hairy hands like coming up that was supposed to be Pamela's hands, but it's a big pair of hands with hair on the knuckles. So yeah, I always thought that was pretty funny. But an interesting twist is that the killer ends up not being Jason Voorhees, but Jason's mom, Pamela, played by Betsy Palmer, who was mad that all these counselors were drinking and smoking and having sex whenever they were supposed to be watching the kids and watching what they were doing. And she blames them for her son Jason drowning. And so she killed the counselors at that camp. And then a new group of counselors are trying to open the camp again, and she doesn't like that, so she starts killing them all one by one. So you also had tropes that you recognize. You have Ralph, the crazy old man who tells them to leave and to get out. You have a strong final girl in Alice who goes up against Pamela and wins by whacking off her head. The only thing I didn't really particularly like is that snake in the cabin. They actually killed that snake. And when I learned that really bothered me. I know it was back before a time where you didn't really have the American Humane Society on set to make sure that animals were being treated properly. So that bothered me. But other than that, yeah, I give it props for being the movie that started it all, for starting Friday the 13th. They didn't know that by starting this, that would eventually lead to the path where Jason Voorhees would become the most recognizable person in pop culture. There are some movies that I like more than this, but I definitely enjoy the OG one and what it did for the Friday the 13th franchise as a whole. Number 5 is Friday the 13th Part 2 with Warrington Gillette as Jason. It is a direct sequel to Friday the 13th, where we have Alice getting killed by Jason. I think if I remember hearing correctly, she wanted to get killed off in the movie because she had problems with a stalker, and that made her very uncomfortable, which I don't blame her. I don't blame her at all. But yeah, Alice gets killed. And then you have Jason going back to Crystal Lake, where you have counselors just trying to do camp stuff. When will they learn not to do camp stuff? And then he starts killing them all one by one until the final showdown with him and Ginny at the end. The kills were all basic in this movie and not that creative. It's just very much stab, stab, stab. But what keeps this movie from being lower on the list for me is I really like the design of Jason. It's very much the town that dreaded sundown vibes, and it's intentional with the mask with the eye hole, the overalls, the plaid shirt. That design of Jason was intentional, meant to mimic the killer in the town that dreads sundown. Is I don't know. There's something about that look I've always liked. I can't explain why. And I like the fact that Ginny defeats him with psychology because she is studying psychology. She defeats him near the end by running into his little hideout in the woods. She doesn't know it's his hideout. He's coming after her. She sees his back room with his mother's head and all the dead bodies. And she gets the idea to put on the mother's sweater because the mother's sweater is in there, and pretend that she is Pamela. And it kind of makes him stop for a minute and be like, oh yeah, well, this is really my mother, cool. But it's all ploy to try and kill him, which I thought that was very clever. It was an interesting twist. So that is why I love this movie. It's because of the look of Jason and because of the way that Ginny defeated him through the use of psychology. She Hannibal Lectered him, which is awesome. And that is why this movie, I've always loved it. And it sits at a number 5 for me because, yes, I love it. I'm telling you, it was hard to rank the movies in these franchise because a lot of them were really good. And the spots came down to minor things, minor nitpicks. But yeah, number 5 for me is Friday the 13th Part 2. Number 4 on my list is Jason X, the last movie in the Friday the 13th franchise where Kane Hodder played as Jason. And if I was doing this list, maybe even 5 years ago, Jason X would not have been up near the top. But a second watch of this film has firmly changed my mind. This movie is just fun. It is doofus, goofy, fun, kind of like Halloween Resurrection was for me. I think you're seeing a trend as to what kinds of horror movies get up near the top of my list is usually the very doofus but also fun ones. And this was that for me. Basically, Jason is being studied at a Crystal Lake research facility. There's this doctor played by David Cronenberg, which I thought was cool. He's played by David Cronenberg, and he was telling the main research scientist woman's like, yeah, I want to take him out of here. And she's like, no. And he's like, too bad. And then, of course, Jason ends up getting loose and starting to kill all the people. And the girl ends up getting him into a cryostasis chamber, but he ends up stabbing her and it ends up putting the room into a lockdown. So they're both put into cryostasis. And then 400 years later, you have these scientists and explorers that find the both of them, bring them on board the ship. She gets unthawed, but so does he. And then it's Jason in space on a spaceship killing people. It wasn't as well received in the United States, but the UK received it a little bit better. I mean, people in the UK who remember when this movie came out, just let me know what you thought of the movie whenever it first came out. But yeah, I thought this movie was a lot of fun. It's isolation, but where Friday the 13th Part 8 was also isolation based on that boat, it had like a lot of filler to it. Jason X didn't really. It was more like an action type horror movie for me. Jason in space, they're isolated on the ship, he's killing them, and they have to try to find somebody to stop him. This like isolation of space freaks me out. And I thought this movie was poking fun at itself. There's this part in the movie where they try and distract Jason with a like simulation where you got two counselors saying, let's smoke and have premarital sex. So poking fun at the fact that Jason likes to kill those college kids that smoke and drink and have premarital sex. And then the fact that hockey being outlawed in 2024, I thought that was kind of funny for some reason. I don't know why. Maybe because it is 2024. I guess we need to be looking for hockey to be outlawed sometime this year for that timeline to make sense. Well, we still got about 3 more months, so you never know. And then the kill that really stood out to me was the frozen nitrogen kill. And I think that's the kill that stands out for a lot of people, but I thought it was cool. And then he smashes her face, and her face just like shatters. I think they even also tested it out on Mythbusters to see if it would actually happen. But yeah, this movie is good fun, doesn't take itself too seriously, knows what it is, can poke fun at itself, and it's Jason in space, and I had a good time watching this movie. So that's why it's number 4. Number 3 on my list is Friday the 13th, Part 6, Jason Lives, with CJ Graham as the role of Jason. And this is the first of the movies where Jason starts to veer into supernatural territory. So you have Tommy Jarvis after the events of Friday the 13th, Part 5. He really, truly wants to make sure that Jason is actually dead because he's sick of him haunting his nightmares and he wants to move on with his life. He goes to the graveyard where he's buried to try and dig him up. Lightning strikes as Tommy is digging him up, and it brings Jason back to life, a la Frankenstein, all the fog in the graveyard, like those old horror movies, and then Jason comes back to life to kill a lot. And then Tommy has to try and figure out a way to stop him since Tommy was the one that woke him up. Darn it, Tommy. Friday the 13th, Part 7 is credited to where Jason is starting to be seen with a bit of personality. But I think that Friday the 13th, Part 6 is where you start to see personality peek out in Jason. So I thought CJ Graham did a good job of bringing that personality to Jason, because there is this part in the woods where he runs across these people that I guess are having some kind of paintball game, and one of them shoots Jason in the chest with a paintball gun, and he looks down at it, and you can tell it kind of like, well, cocks his head, kind of looks at him. He goes, really? Like, really? Really? You think that's gonna do anything? And then the way he looks at that RV, like, if the RV's a rockin', don't come a knockin'. But the way he looks at that RV, it's just like, well, what's going on there? You see inklings of a personality from Jason in this movie. And the fact that you can see that personality poke through with a mask on, I like that. Here, I think this is the movie too where Jason first gets his machete as his main weapon, when in the other movies he was using all sorts of different weapons. But don't quote me on that because I'm not sure. Maybe it's Friday the 13th, Part 4 where he first got his machete, but let me know if it was Part 4 or Part 6 where he first got his machete, or maybe both of those are wrong. But if you know where Jason first got his machete, let me know in the comments below, because I would be very grateful to have the answer to that one. And this movie balanced horror and comedic undertones, like with the two boys talking about how they were going to be dead meat, real dead meat. And one of them says to the other, so what were you going to be when you grew up? Which I thought was unexpected and funny. Then you have one of the campers reading Jean-Paul Sartre's No Exit, which I thought was a funny little poke at the fact that there were a lot of people that were probably going to die. I thought that was really clever. I mean, go kid for reading Sartre. This is a Friday the 13th movie that had a old-time horror vibe, Frankenstein type vibe. I liked the look of Jason. I liked who played Jason. I thought that the story was very well paced. It had the right balance of horror and humor, which is why it sits at number 3 for me. Number 2 on my list of Jason movies is Freddy versus Jason. Now, if you remember when I ranked it in my Nightmare on Elm Street rankings, I had that movie at number 3. So as far as all of the Jason movies, it's the movies that are featuring Jason, it is number 2 here. I won't go into too much detail about my thoughts on Freddy versus Jason, because if you've been following me for a while, you know. And if you want to check out my thoughts on Freddy versus Jason, you can watch the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise ranking. But yeah, love this movie, have loved it since I first saw it. It is one of my favorite horror comfort movies. I like King Kurzinger as Jason. I like his iteration of the slow, lumbering stalker. And yeah, I can't really say much more about it other than you know that I think it's awesome. And number 1 is the Friday the 13th reboot, reimagining, remake, whatever you want to call it, that was made in 2009. The same screenwriters for Freddy vs. Jason were the screenwriters for this movie as well, Damien Shannon and Mark Swift. And you also had the same director for this movie that directed the Texas Chainsaw Massacre remake, Marcus Nispel. You got all these campers near Crystal Lake, and Jason doesn't like that, and he seeks to pick them up one by one, and he ends up taking this girl named Whitney, because later on you find out that she reminds him of his mother whenever his mother was young. And then her brother Clay, played by Jared Padalecki, has been looking for his missing sister for a month. And that's where he kind of crosses paths with some other people who are up near Crystal Lake. And they all pretty much get killed one by one, except for the brother and sister who survived all the events in the movie. What I don't understand about this movie is why it was trashed so much. That's what stopped me from watching this movie for the longest time. I watched it for the first time a couple years ago because people were saying that it was utter garbage and trash. And then when I watched it, I was like, I don't think it's garbage and trash. I actually thought it was really good. And I kind of know why, since the same director who directed the Texas Chainsaw Massacre remake, which is one of my favorite movies, he directed this one, and it makes a whole lot of sense because there's his bleak style, and his bleak visuals that come through. It worked in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre remake, and it worked here as well. And I like the fact that was almost a reimagining of parts 1 through 4, because you saw Jason with kind of like the same kind of head covering that he had in 2. You saw him use weapons that he's used in the other movies, like the axe. And of course, you also see the machete. The mask was molded and tweaked just a little bit from the original mask design of the mask from Friday the 13th Part 3. And you even had some of Harry Manfredini's original score. So I felt this movie did a good balance of having those iconic moments from the other movies and the franchise. They even had a sleeping bag kill, but they made it their own. So I thought they did a good job of paying respect to the other movies of the franchise while still making the movie their own. It didn't feel like, oh, this is a moment and this is a moment and this is something that happened in the movie. It didn't feel like it was thrown in there just because, like in Halloween Kills with the Silver Shamrock masks. It felt like it had a purpose. And I like Derek Mears as Jason. This Jason, they wanted him as a quiet stalking killer who had a bit of a backstory that you could almost feel sympathy for him. I mean, the only thing I feel sympathy for him is that he had to watch his mother die right in front of him. But then again, I can't feel sorry for someone like Jason who is going to grow up and be feral and go around killing people. Sorry, I will never feel sorry for Jason, ever. Again, I like the two survivor angle. I felt that was a good homage to Friday the 13th Part 4, where you had a brother and sister surviving there. Here you have a brother and sister surviving here. And there's something about brother sister angles whenever they're used in horror movies that I really appreciate. This movie is definitely not the worst in the franchise. Like I said, I felt it was a good homage to the other movies in the franchise. I thought Derek Ramirez was a good Jason. I thought the movie had a good, simple story with good pacing, and it is definitely worth checking out if you haven't. And this movie is number 1 in my rankings. I don't know why I held up 2 fingers. I should just be holding up 1. Number 1 in my rankings. And whoo, finally did it, y'all. I have ranked all 12 movies in the Friday the 13th franchise. Again, if you want to share your rankings or your favorite movie from the franchise, or the movie that you like the least in the franchise, or if you want to throw out anything else about the Friday the 13th franchise that you want to talk about, do it in the comments below. And sadly, class is dismissed, everybody, for now, but I will see you next time. Bye.